Here. Up next, we're lucky enough to have discussions with the two most recent chairmen of the Federal Reserve. Unfortunately, Mr. Volcker is in Europe and was unable to be here in person, but we did manage to get a taped interview with him recently, which we'll show, followed by a live conversation with Chairman Greenspan immediately following. So let's roll that video, and following which Mr. Greenspan will come up. Thank you.
That you agreed to this interview. Do you believe the current long-term or structural fiscal outlook is or is not sustainable? Not too many years ago, you predicted that there was a 75% chance there would be a crisis. You turned out to be correct. Let's move fast forward to today. If no action is taken, what do you think the outcomes might be?
Well, I'm not going to put any precise date on when a collision arises. Stability gets more and more jeopardized the bigger the deficit gets and the longer it goes on. Right now, I think the country's been in a recession. It's been in a deep recession. Nobody wants to take strong fiscal action for fear of impairing the recovery at the moment. So we're talking something next year, the following year down the road, and how big is the hole going to be? Not bigger than this year, which has this huge deficit because of the recession, but bigger than the 1 or 2% of GDP patterns that we've had in the past. We can't go on and let it go to 5%, 6%, 7% of the GDP indefinitely. You raise a question at some point, who's going to buy all those securities, whether that's compatible with price stability in the United States. And once you begin raising a serious question about people's unwillingness to buy U.S. government securities, is really the basis of the whole world's financial system. And you begin talking about a possible inflationary implication. Those are very dangerous possibilities for the standpoint of the world economy as well as the United States economy.
With the 78 million baby boomers and so forth, the sheer magnitude of some of these liabilities is quite unprecedented. What impact does that have on the likely magnitude or nature of a crisis?
I do not think there is any question but that the big entitlement programs have an outlook of rising expenditures and rising deficits from the kind of funding that's now provided. Now, there's not much you can do, I think, practically to radically change that situation in the short run. But what we can do, and I think it's very important to do it, is begin laying the groundwork for slowing those inevitable deficits down 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, where it's just a yawning increase in the size of the health care and Social Security deficits. The most manageable of that outlook is Social Security. There should be a bipartisan interest in it of taking measures that are quite reasonable measures, would not require any significant increase in taxes, to stabilize the outlook for Social Security for the indefinite future. Now, that may not be big savings in the short run. It may not be any savings at all in the very short run. But I think psychologically, the fact that it would have a real impact over time is reassuring that we can step up to this problem. But that is one of the easier things to do, in my opinion. Sounds odd to say any change in Social Security is easy. But we've done it before. We've done it with some success before. And there simply isn't any reason why we can't do it again. It would probably involve raising the age limit a little bit more. Not drastically, but some increase. But life expectancy is rising. People are working. Why am I still sitting here half working these days when 20 years ago I wouldn't have thought of it?
Everybody talks, Paul, about everything has to be on the table. What would you be willing to have on the table?
I think both economically and certainly politically, you've got to look at every possibility for savings on the expenditure side first. Says everything? I suppose it includes some defense stuff. And there are arguments now about particular defense, large defense procurement programs, whether it's really a matter of priority, whether it's really necessary. Well, some of those issues ought to get resolved by saying no, as I think the Secretary of Defense has said. We've got to certainly revamp Social Security. The big elephant, of course, is Medicare, healthcare generally. And I'm no expert there, but I know it's a problem, and we got to put our best thought to dealing with it. And I hope there are things in this present bill that at least point in the right direction. If it's not in the present bill, it's going to have to be in some subsequent bill.
You know, it's been said that many Republicans have never met a tax cut they didn't like and a tax increase they didn't hate, and that the Democrats have rarely met a universal entitlement program they didn't want to explore.
Part of my explanation for why we do rather well in budgetary terms in the 90s is precisely what you said, that the two parties vetoed each other's deficit-creating plans. When you didn't have any tax cuts, and when you had some expenditure restraint and entitlement restraint, eventually you ran a surplus.
Yeah. The subject of revenue increases, do you think we need to consider those?
I think it is very likely, after all we do on expenditures and try our best on expenditures with everything on the table, if we are left, to put it in statistical terms, with expenditures of 22% of the GDP, or 23%, or 24%, or even 25%, which is what some projections say, as against the historic trend of about 20%. And we've got a revenue machine that produces less than 20% of revenues. We've got to do something. And unless we can bring that expenditure thing back down to 20% of GDP, which I'm a bit skeptical about, to say the least, doesn't say we shouldn't try, then we've got to think about taxes. And I think we've kind of exhausted the present tax system. The payroll tax is quite high. The corporate income tax is too high from many points of view. The personal income tax goes up and down a little bit, but I don't think you're going to solve the deficit problem with the personal income tax, nor with the estate tax. If you have to raise taxes, or even substitute some of the present taxes, what's the most efficient way to do it? And there aren't all that many alternatives that jump out at you. We do have an environmental problem. We've got a global warming problem. Does that point us toward a carbon tax or an energy tax in terms of energy self-sufficiency? Both of those could be major revenue producers that would have beneficial effects along with some adverse effects too, but they would deal with other national problems. You've got the more general issue of a value-added tax, which is common in every other industrialized country and never been popular in the United States, and it's not, I don't think it's on the political table now or for the indefinite future, but that's the kind of thing you have to look at. The basic thing is, if we've done all we can do on expenditures, and it's not enough, I think you have to face up to the revenue side.
I think, as you know as well as I, if you go out further, 20, 30 years, the expenditures are a lot higher than 25%. They 30 plus 35.
Well, yes.
And that's when we really run into.
And a lot of that is the entitlement programs. And
right.
So the entitlement programs have to be front and center here.
One of the arguments for doing something is this whole idea of confidence building, that somehow we convey the message to the rest of the world who are lending us all this money that we're finally getting our act together. How much emphasis do you put on the confidence?
Well, I put on some. You know, what we can do concretely at the moment is limited for the reasons I suggest. We're still coming out of the early stages of coming out of the recession. A lot of questions about the strength of the recovery, continued high level of unemployment. It's not an economic situation that's conducive to strong action. So what can we do? In my view, we could deal with the Social Security problem reasonably promptly. It's not going to produce a big change in the fiscal situation in the short run, but it's confidence building. What the President has decided, and what many people in the Congress and outside the Congress have suggested, I think including some important nonprofit institutions, is to have an honest-to-goodness outside commission look at it. Getting underway a very tough mandate to produce a comprehensive solution to this problem by December. If it does nothing else, it focuses on the problem, and it, I would hope, comes up with some constructive ideas that will be doable in an orderly way over the next few years.
There are some people that say we can grow out of these problems.
Well, I think these projections we're talking about assume growth. It's impossible to be so optimistic as to growth, to think we're going to grow our way out of this trajectory that seems to be built in. That, obviously, growth will help, but it's not going to solve the problem, in my opinion.
When the economy starts to recover, there are expectations that the Fed will have to increase rates. As you look at this, how does this relate to this fiscal outlook, in your opinion?
Well, it certainly relates in the sense of the confidence point that you raised. Is this country capable of getting its act together to deal with the fiscal problem and head off any inflationary repercussions of the very easy monetary policies we have? Have we got the wisdom and the backbone to do that in time? And it is a very difficult challenge for any country at any time, and that challenge is, I don't know that I'd say front and center, because you don't have to do it right now for the reasons I suggested, but you've got to build confidence that you're going to do it in a timely way, and that takes action. Takes action on the Social Security front. It will take action on the monetary policy front before too much time passes if the economy continues to recover. I don't think it's a technical problem. I think the Federal Reserve is able to do this. In these terms, what's really critically important, and I can't let this go without using the word again, about the importance of maintaining price stability and policies aimed at price stability. If we have these budget deficits, if we have these big increases in indebtedness as built into the system, if we have a lot of liquidity in the system, it's terribly important that people maintain confidence in the stability of our currency. How many trillions of dollars of U.S. assets are held abroad now? And they're held abroad to some degree because they have some confidence those assets are going to be worth something in terms of their own currency. And that means stability in our price level. Currency can have ups and downs, but it can't have a feeling that the dollar has no place to go but down. That would be very destructive in these situations.
One final question, Paul. I was rather surprised the other day to look at so-called tax preferences and discovering that they amounted to something like $1 trillion. Mortgage deductions and the way we treat health care expense and so forth. Do you have any overview of how we have to think about our tax system?
If we can't control it by reducing spending, we've got to do something about taxes. Now, you include in that area something about taxes might be getting rid of some of these preferences because they are enormous. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical you can do enough of that to cure the budgetary problem that looms ahead. You could keep the income tax rates more or less where they are, simplify them a bit, probably increase some basic exemptions, do something about the corporate income tax. If you were really willing to take a swinging attack on those preferences you're talking about, both in the corporate area and on the personal area. Look, the big one personally is the mortgage deduction, which no other country provides. But, you know, to just mention that possibility, it doesn't sound all that promising. But it would be healthy, in my view, to get rid of all of them you could, which reduces the need to raise tax rates or a new tax.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you are a rare national treasure.
Well, thank you. But we haven't had any very good news to talk about.
Well, hearing from you makes it more palatable. Thank you, sir. Always
well, you're welcome.
We obviously have another former chairman of the Federal Reserve that needs no introduction, and I will not give him one except in one respect. There's been commentary, Mr. Chairman, on your successful experience with the 1983 Social Security Commission. What has not been mentioned is one of your personal qualities that may have led to that result. And it is evidenced most on the golf course. I have never seen a more relentless negotiator who is willing to give up less than this gentleman. if you play golf with the chairman, you have to allow enough room on the first tee that equals roughly the amount of time you take to play golf. So typically, if the golf game starts at 2 o'clock, you get there about 10 in order to have a negotiation that you always lose. I have a feeling that had a lot to do with the success of your commission. Now, another problem is no one ever accuses you of excessive generosity, of giving things up. Now, there's a word in golf called a gimme putt. And most gentlemen in golf, if the putt is 3 inches or less, usually say, go ahead, take it. The ball could be hanging on the edge of the cup, and he would not yield it. To him, a gimme putt is another oxymoron. There is no such thing as a gimme putt. So I think that personal quality that you have might be one that Bowles and Simpson could use in coming up with this. Now, I'm not going to give you equal time for...
if I took equal time, we'd be finished. But you have convinced me that there is a general flaw in the way I look at this process. Henceforth, when you and I play golf, I will deign to give you 2-inch putts.
You see that negotiating process? You start with 0 and you inch up, as it were. Very good.
Have you ever made a 2-inch putt?
All right. Mr. Chairman, we've been talking about the unsustainability or sustainability, the longer outlook. I not only want to be interested in whether you think it's sustainable or not, but something kind of puzzles me. If the outlook is so dire, why isn't it reflected in the long-term interest rates?
I think this is a terribly important issue, largely because it's very difficult to make the argument for fiscal restraint without consequences which invariably must lead to inflation. And if there is no inflation, the process of moving towards a restraint is very significantly undermined. So that if you take a look at where we are now, the reason why interest rates are so low, and here we should be talking mainly about market interest rates, longer term, the 10-year Treasury note, the 30-year bond. The reason those rates are low is that the global economy is still coming out of a very deep period of deflation. And so the notion of inflation expectations is pretty much at the moment out of the system. That's going to change. At the moment, the financial system, both in the United States and across the globe, is still fragile. But we are to the point where the solvency of our banking system is really no longer a concern of anybody, for no other reason that there is still a belief that the U.S. government will step in and prevent a too-big-to-fail type of situation. But what we have here is a situation which cannot be sustained. The reason, basically, is that we're beginning to see a gradual easing up. And the most important thing that's happening in the United States, and indeed around the world, is that the extremely severe inventory liquidation that occurred immediately following the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, that is taken out a very large chunk of commercial and industrial loans out of the system, which, as you know, are the major forms of financing. We're now beginning to see that the level of inventories after this horrendous decline is now in the process of stabilizing. And without getting into the technicalities of all the things that are going on with respect to the inventories markets, it's turning up, and it looks as though it's going to move up fairly considerably. If that is the case, we're going to find that the trillion or so of excess reserves that depository institutions are holding at Federal Reserve banks, which are being held there with only 25 basis points, whereas they can get well over 3% in C&I loans. It's basically saying that there's credit risk fear of 300 basis points on very short maturity issues. This is the type of psychology, if it persisted, is inimical to inflation, and indeed, if anything, it's the other way around. But that is in the process of changing. And as it begins to change in a significant manner, we're going to begin to see the so-called money multiplier start to work, which means that the banks with these huge amounts of short-term liquid assets is going to start to make loans. And this is going to create an increase in the money supply, and ultimately, not immediately, it's going to be able to move the system away from this deflationary environment. And it's in that type of environment which I think we have to be very much concerned about all of a sudden the psychology turning very quickly, as I think Peter Orszag mentioned. We don't realize how fast that can happen. You remember in the latter part of 1979, long-term interest rates went up 400 basis points in 5 months or 4 months or something like that. And that is a startling change. And if we ran into that sort of problem, it would crush our system. So we've got to get this issue of the budget solved sooner rather than later.
All right. Are there any other effects or risks of not taking timely action on the longer-term budget situation?
Oh, yeah. I think that everyone is pretty much going with the Congressional Budget Office forecasts and OMB forecasts. I think that's the right thing to do for the average. But in my experience, and I think the experience of all those who are putting these forecasts together, is that our ability to forecast is very poor. We do not have a reasonable set of notions of what the cost of Medicare is going to be 10, 15 years from now. We make estimates, but the estimates are based on small samples of various different tests, and with this extraordinary change that is currently going on in innovation in the medical system. And remember, innovation by definition is not forecastable. We know it's going to happen, we know there's going to be more of it, and the quality of medical care is improving very dramatically. And I think there's problems of what do you do with the number of transplants that's going to start to occur? I mean, it's going to become a routine operation, but they're very expensive. And so we have the potential here of having a very small capability of forecasting within a narrow range. And what that means is the following. If we are in the current position where the federal debt is rapidly closing in on the level of our capacity to borrow, for the first time since 1791, we're beginning to see real serious questions as to whether we're going to be running into serious problems in that area. I find that very worrisome. And if at the same time there is a very major question about what the range of error is, forget the statistics, and you just look at public policy in this area, and it basically has to go around the question, not of your forecast so much, but what happens if your forecast is wrong? And in this particular instance, with the buffer gradually moving closer, I don't know if it's rapid or gradual, but it's certainly moving, we have to be in a position where if we make a mistake here and we underestimate in a significant manner what the upside of outlays are, it is extremely dangerous to the system. If we are wrong on the downside, that's all well and good. We can adjust to that. So we're not confronting an issue of how do we take the current services budget, put on programs are and make adjustments, we've got to keep in mind the fact that there is a cost-benefit analysis here on policy, which requires that we focus on the notion of trying to make certain that the catastrophic event does not happen. And that means to me that we have to not only curtail expenditures or basically reduce the budget deficit that we're projecting, but aim at a much lower deficit than we really think is likely to happen.
How long would you guess we have before there is truly a significant increase in long-term rates, perhaps related to the market's perception of the fiscal situation? You've always been an expert in constructive ambiguity, and my guess is you may duck this question, but I think people are interested in knowing how long have we got here before something major happens to you.
Yeah, well, to say that I know how long is clearly something which is a little more than a guess. But I'll tell you what I look at every morning. I look at the yield on the 10-year note, which has been hovering under 4% for quite a while. And that's extraordinarily low in this type of environment. And so I think, as I've mentioned previously, that the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, is the 10-year note and the 30-year bond. If they start to move up in a significant manner, it is suggestive of the fact that we are in trouble. And once that begins to happen, action has got to be taken reasonably quickly, or we're not going to be able to head it off. My guess, and who knows what one can guess here, I think we've got a year, because this deflation has not yet turned around. So we still have got deflationary pressures. But remember, the rest of the world is beginning to move. East Asia is doing exceptionally well. Even Latin America, Brazil is doing very well, and the remainder of Latin America is doing well. We are doing okay. The American economy is accelerating faster than we realize. The trouble is in Europe, where we have a major problem for the exchange rate problems, and in Japan, which is coming back. I mean, everybody's coming back, but there are laggards. And the problems are getting closer and closer to where the deflation is going to be behind us, and the real issue of inflation begins to arise, which, as Paul Volcker said, which I agree with fully, you can't have a system in which you have very large deficits, very large expansion in the monetary base, and not ultimately get inflation. It has never happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the Fed, what can the Fed do about some of these longer range problems?
It's mainly out of the hands of the Federal Reserve in the sense that these are very deep-seated political, cultural type of problems. What bothers me specifically is that in recent months we are exhibiting an absolute inability to cut anything. I would think the C-17, which is a great cargo plane, we got too many of them according to the Air Force. They're trying to cut back and they're running into difficulties. The space program, which the other day came out with some cuts and everyone started to rumble. The thing actually which bothers me the most in this sort of game playing is the issue of financing the Consumer Protection Agency with Federal Reserve funds. The reason they are doing that is that it appears to be unappropriated funds and it doesn't affect the budget deficit. And it isn't like getting PAYGO, which was not required for that operation. What it is, of course, is that if you fund the Consumer Protection Agency with Fed revenues, those revenues are not also available to be paid to the Treasury, and therefore you got a reduction in receipts, and it doesn't appear to be attributable to the Consumer Protection Agency. So that we've got so many of these gimmicks that we're using, which we just refuse basically to cut back on anything. And the one thing I must say about the meeting you've held here, I think I'm beginning to hear that there's a recognition of this, and the startling fact is a willingness to put the existing health care program on the table.
I mentioned earlier, given my Greek descent, I've been reluctant to bring up Greece in this session. Is there anything in the Greek situation that in any way suggests parallels between us, or what do you take out of what's happening there?
Yeah, there are parallels and there are very significant differences. Let me just mention the differences quickly. The Greek situation is one in which there has been profligate deficits for years. When they went into the euro, the presumption was, and indeed it happened, that exchanging the drachma for the euro would lower their interest rates, and it did. But what it also did, which is the other side of the balance sheet, is essentially to raise the basic exchange rate to a non-competitive level, because obviously if inflation is more rampant in Greece than it is in Germany, you're going to get a non-competitive exchange rate. And this is creating a major problem, and clearly we're not in that position where we have a fixed exchange rate. We have a variable exchange rate, and we do, remember, have extraordinary access to the rest of the world's savings because we are the reserve currency. But what the Greek situation does suggest to us is that a major civilized country can get itself into the types of things that we're beginning to see in the United States. I mean, to just repeat, I cannot conceive of anything you could recommend at this particular point which will cut spending. I mean, there's even a problem in the unemployment insurance benefits, which they can't get through a longer-term projection because they can't find the funds, essentially, to under PAYGO to meet the demand. So they're stuck with a short-term unemployment insurance benefit. Now, it strikes me that the reason, of course, they can't get the funds is they've used those funds for something else, and which they had originally agreed upon. So that we're coming to essentially a bankrupt process, which something has got to give. And I'm fearful that because, as everybody has noted, medical care is the big 800-pound gorilla in the system, we have to shrink that in some form or another. And I must admit, I cannot come out other than we are committing far more resources than we physically have, and that means we have to ration. Maybe the thing to do is to change the word so it becomes politically acceptable, but we do ration. It's just now the physicians ration, and they ration in lots of other different ways. But you cannot have a fee-for-service, subsidized third-party payment system in an area where people find it's extraordinarily important to be in a position where they can get the medical care they want, and it is a value. I mean, it's part of the GDP, and it should be. But there is no question that if you get very large parts of the GDP going to medical care, it means huge amount of the workforce is working in medical services. It means capital resources are in medical services, and they are not simultaneously available for other aspects of economic growth. And since our growth is limited, we have to recognize that we're requiring and we're demanding a number of things, all of which are very important to us. But if you add them all up, we don't have the resources to do them all. We have to make choices.
I heard, Alan, that something like 5-6 of our total health care expenditures, the consumer has no particular knowledge of what the costs are and no particular incentive to reduce them. Does that fit into your concept of the culture that we have?
Well, it's sort of, the question answers itself in the sense that's essentially what this nature, what's wrong with the system, is that you have there's no effective rationing mechanism in a system where, for example, we know that we're not going to be able to get growth in our economy from productivity of more than 3% a year for any protracted period. And the reason for that is if you go back over say back to 1870, we have never had a period in the United States, or maybe very, very few periods, where output per hour grew more than 3% over a 15-year period or less than 1% over the 15-year periods. And that is telling us something about how our economy, culture, and technologies work. We are at the cutting edge of technology, and therefore we cannot borrow productivity or technology like the Chinese can do from us and grow much faster than we do. So that we don't have the capability, considering the fact that we know within a reasonably narrow level what the working age population is going to be in 2030, therefore what the labor force is going to be, and if you attach that to the productivity growth, you know what our physical resources are, the outside limit. And right now, we have committed to a much larger requirement than would be consistent with stability in that limited overall real GDP concept. And that's what our problem is. I mean, it's not that medical care is an extraordinarily highly valued product, as everybody is now demonstrating. So is food, so is clothing, so are other things. We've got to make choices, and our political system does not seem to be able to make choices. And that's the reason why, if the Commission works, and if it can put everything on the table, and the President is going to support what they do, I grant you that the odds are still small because it's going to be very tough. And I wish them well.
Well, speaking of the Commission, you had a successful experience. What are the parallels that you see between your commission and this one? And if Alan Simpson and Erskine, who have been here, were here, what advice would you give them? Well,
there is an important reason why that commission worked and others don't. If you have a commission which starts off, deliberates, writes a report, and then gives it to the Congress, you get immediate reaction from the Congress about all the things they don't like. And even after when you explain it to them, they say, yeah, that makes sense, but I've already taken my position. So what it is that we did, which was evolved, is that we recognized that this was a controversial issue, and that unless we had really bipartisan agreement, it wouldn't work. And what happened was that Bob Ball, who was a very important analyst and Social Security Commissioner many years ago, was the head, I would say, Tip O'Neill's man on the commission, and I was President Reagan and Jim Baker's man on the commission. The two of us worked together exceptionally well, and what we did is kept our superiors fully informed as to what was going on. So as the Commission made progress, it was coming to agreements, we brought the key political people involved to make certain that we could get support. And at the end of the day, we did come together with very few dissenting votes. Bob Ball and I decided that at the Ways and Means Committee, whenever we testified on the bill, that we would stipulate that this is not an amendable recommendation. You take it or you leave it. And I would answer questions to Bob from the Republicans, and he would answer questions from the Democrats. And eventually, the bill went through the Congress very closely aligned to what the Commission stipulated. So I think if there is a lesson to learn, is that there is no such thing as an independent commission that doesn't link itself up in real time to the political mechanism. And I would very much suggest to these veteran co-heads who know more about this issue than I could ever know, that they make certain that as they go forward, that the President's on board and the senior people in the Republican Congress are shaking their heads in agreement, because if that does not happen, the Commission will write a very interesting report, and everyone may read it, get good press, and then goes on the shelf for posterity.
Very interesting. My final question. You've been involved with Social Security for 30 years or more. We heard some people say that the trust fund will keep the system solvent for 30 years or more. And that it has $2.5 trillion of assets in it. What would you say about these statements? And more generally, what is the economic significance of the trust funds? Because if the American people believe that we don't have a problem for 40 years or 30 years, it would seem to me they're very unlikely to support reform, because if there's no problem, why do you need a solution?
Well, that's a valid issue.
Yeah. So why don't you help straighten this out?
Well, first of all, let's remember that unlike trust funds, which are off-budget types of things, we've seen in the private sector, we see them in the public sector, that's not what Social Security Trust Fund is. Start with the premise that what the law stipulates is that in the event that the trust fund goes to zero, the Social Security Administration can pay benefits only to the extent that dedicated payroll taxes come in, which means effectively a significant cut in benefits. Now, the probability in this political context, after all we talked about having the difficulties of cutting, the possibility of that actually happening is zero. And if I were to revise it, I would say the zero is too high. Now, once you start with that premise, then what it essentially means is that when you begin to have the level of benefits rise, let's say, first, if the benefits are below the dedicated tax, there is no problem. It's only when benefits begin to rise above the taxes that you begin to get a reduction in the trust fund. Now, if you get down to zero, and in effect, general revenues are effectively put back into the fund, you are doing exactly what the fiscal situation would do if the Social Security Trust Fund never existed. Because what you're doing is Congress votes a level of benefits, and it effectively guarantees it. Now, whether it is using the dedicated taxes or general revenues is difficult to tell, because they're intermixable, obviously, and so that effectively the issue of the trust fund does not change any action that anybody is taking. If there is a trust fund and it's guaranteed so that when it runs out, it gets replenished, what's happening is that all of the shortfall in receipts is met by marketable securities being sold for cash to get the monies to pay the benefits. That's what happens with or without the trust fund. And since it makes no difference, the trust fund has no economic significance from an accounting point of view. And if you wanted a trust fund that was off budget, it's got to have non-federal assets in it, mainly, say, municipal securities or more generally private securities, because if you have receipts of dedicated taxes falling below the benefits, you can draw on those assets. That action does not affect the unified budget.
So in other words, for it to have economic significance, to be sure I understand you, you would need assets in there that were really independent assets of some sort.
Yes, they cannot be merely obligations or guaranteed obligations of the United States government, because it's the same thing as a corporation which has got an intra-company transfer. On a consolidated basis, it washes out.
Yeah.
And on a consolidated unified budget basis, the Social Security Trust Fund washes out.
Washes out. Mr. Chairman, I'm so grateful to you that I'm giving you 20 strokes.
21?
You would normally ask me for how many holes, and the answer is 2,000.
Oh.
Thank you very much, sir. Great job.
Look at that one. Thank you. Much has been said today about seeking a consensus on the fiscal challenge. As it happens, we have at least one model for bipartisan agreement to tell you about. The results are in from a survey commissioned by the Foundation of the most senior economic officials from the last 8 administrations and congressional leaders from the last 30 years. The respondents were asked about the challenges posed by our long-term structural deficits, as well as possible solutions. And the outcome was something we haven't experienced in Washington in a long time: consensus. Here to tell us more about the survey results is Jeff Pollack from the public opinion research firm that carried out the survey, Global Strategy Group. Jeff?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'd like to begin. I'm going to show you the results of the survey that we conducted. And I'm going to start, hopefully there we go. So let me begin by talking about what we did. Sorry, could you go back, please? One slide. What we did is we conducted a survey whereby, as Michael said, we talked to some of the nation's foremost economic thinkers. Essentially, we compiled a list of folks in the last number of decades, who are A, still alive, and B, obviously, and B, who were not currently serving in office in any way. And all of the titles you can see right there, in terms of the kind of folks that we talked to: secretaries of the Treasury, people from the legislative and executive branches. We're talking about folks who are directors of OMB. We're talking about Council of Economic Advisors. And so when you look at that list of titles that you can see on both sides, on both monitors, it's an impressive list of people. And if you take all of them, it's about 100 or so people over the last number of decades. We sent a survey out to them and got a response back amazingly, from 58 people. And the response that we got, we were getting FedExes the day we sent it, we got it back the next day. It was quite amazing how invested folks were. One very high-level economic official forgot to send in one page. We got a frantic phone call that they had the page and they wanted to get it faxed over to us. So these are folks who cared very much about the results. And so let's go through some of them. First and foremost, we've divided them up by Republicans and Democrats, and the reason for doing that is quite simple. We wanted to show what people who are a part of Republican administrations or Democratic administrations believe. And what we found more than anything is that there is absolute bipartisan consensus on everything. On every metric that we measured, there is bipartisan consensus. And so, for example, we asked the question, do you agree or disagree that if we don't act soon to address the nation's long-term fiscal situation, we're heading for another major economic crisis? And look at Republicans, 63% strongly agree, Democrats 71%, but overwhelmingly over 90% of both total agree. In addition, there is unanimous, and I mean literally unanimous, 100% of both Republicans and Democrats said that the federal government is currently on an unsustainable fiscal path. In addition, they all feel unanimously, 100% believe that the long-term structural deficits that we face are far more of a crisis that we need to focus on than any kind of short-term ones. Next, what you'll see is we asked people a couple of different things about timing, and overwhelmingly people think that the economic crisis that we're facing is going to happen sometime in the next, say, 3 to 10 years. But more impressively, among both Republicans and Democrats, 92% of Republicans and 82% of Democrats say we must take action in the next 1 to 2 years. So even though they know that it's coming, that the crisis is coming a little bit later, they believe we've got to take action now. And again, as I said, both sides of the aisle agree. We also asked people what they thought if we failed to enact some meaningful measures in order to address the structural deficit, what is likely to encounter? And you can see, again, bipartisan agreement, Republicans and Democrats. For example, 80% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats said we're likely to see rapid growth in federal spending. We're likely to see a rise in interest rates. We're likely to see, most impressively, a decline in the U.S. standard of living. 65% of Republicans and 53% of Democrats. An impressively high number of people who say that this is very likely, not just likely, but very likely. And that intensity is an important point. You can see that there's agreement across the board that so many things are problems that are coming if we don't address this shortly. In one of the most bright line findings, though, so many times in Washington we hear about one solution versus the other, in particular tax cuts versus spending cuts. And what we can see from our sample of economic leaders is that the answer is that both are absolutely necessary. Among Democrats, 88% say both spending cuts and tax increases are necessary, but even among Republicans, more than two-thirds, 68%, say both spending cuts and tax increases are absolutely necessary to solve our long-term structural deficit. Some other things that people agree with, 100%, for example, agree that we need to seriously consider overall spending cuts. We need to consider entitlement reforms like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid reforms. But we also have to reform our tax code. 100% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats agree. And even tax increases. You can see, as I mentioned before, we asked two questions here, but in either case, both Republicans and Democrats agree that we absolutely need to consider tax increases as a part of things. So significant decreases in discretionary spending, tax increases, all options have to be on the table. So the notion is that economic leaders today, economic leaders who have been a part of our nation, have watched where we're going, have been a part of what we were doing and see where we are going, universally agree that we've got to address these things now and that we need bipartisan agreement, we need all sides of the table, and it fits very perfectly in with what the Commission is doing today. I'd like to thank you for giving me this time.
It's now my pleasure to not only introduce but thank David Walker, our President and CEO, who I call some combination between Paul Revere and an Energizer bunny. He's been to 41 states. He's made hundreds of speeches all over the country. He has done all kinds of op-ed articles and TV interviews and so forth. It's a testimony to the depth of his marriage that has survived it. But Dave, I just want to say that we want to express our deep appreciation to you for all you've done on behalf of the country. And I know your previous experience as Comptroller General is still more evidence that you're an American patriot. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dave Walker.
Thank you, Pete, very much. And let me, on behalf of all of us here, thank you for your generosity in putting your money where your mouth is and your time where your heart lies with regard to federal fiscal responsibility and trying to make sure that it's not an oxymoron. We're approaching the end of this conference, and I want to thank everybody who participated throughout the day. We've heard many perspectives and opinions from a variety of players across the political spectrum, and that's exactly as it should be. As Americans, we not only speak our minds about governance and policy challenges facing this country, we also understand that freedom of speech is an essential part of our democracy. As has been discussed, prior to this conference, the Peterson Foundation funded a confidential survey of former top executive branch, congressional, and Federal Reserve officials and solicited their views on a range of timely and important fiscal issues. The results were revealing and of critical importance. These bipartisan top officials from the past several decades reached unanimous agreement that our federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path. These top economic officials believe that the United States will ultimately face a major economic crisis if we fail to address our structural deficits, mounting debt burdens, and imprudent reliance on foreign lenders. There was also strong bipartisan agreement that everything must be on the table, including budget controls, social insurance reforms, defense and other spending constraints, and additional revenues. During this summit, we've heard a number of people reinforce these important survey findings, including the fact that the real problem is our structural deficits and not the short-term deficit. We heard from former President Clinton about how he made fiscal responsibility a top priority and achieved real results. President Clinton also reminded us that while the federal challenge is great, many states face their own fiscal imbalances that need to be addressed, and that we may well have to reorganize government, both the executive and legislative branch, in order to get the job done. We heard that health care costs remain the single largest challenge to our nation's fiscal future. Importantly, there is strong agreement that there are no easy solutions and that a range of tough choices will be required if we want our collective future to be better than our past. This includes taking a hard look at the approximate $1 trillion in tax preferences that represent backdoor spending, and starting to make sure that the government is focusing more on the future rather than the past. It also includes recognizing the significant differences in cost of living in different geographic areas around the United States. Finally, the two co-chairs of the President's Fiscal Responsibility and Reform Commission discussed what they plan to do to discharge their responsibilities and help our growing federal fiscal challenge. And now, as we prepare to leave here, the real work begins. We did not come together just to hear ourselves talk. What brought us to this summit is a shared sense of urgency. Ever since our founding, America has offered each generation the opportunity for a better life. Now we have to put that long-standing tradition at risk. Serious structural deficits and mounting debt burdens threaten the future prosperity of our country, its position in the world, and the quality of life for our children and grandchildren. This is the challenge that will exist after the economy has fully recovered, after unemployment levels are down, after the wars are over, and long after the financial and housing crises have passed. Our actions in the months and years ahead will either preserve the American dream for generations to come or further mortgage their future. So we are facing not only an economic challenge, but an ethical and a moral challenge as well. All of us gathered here are committed to meeting those challenges, and I'm convinced that we will. After all, this is America. But the only way this will happen, short of a crippling crisis, is if the first three words of the Constitution come alive: we the people. Many Americans complain about politicians in Washington, but we the people are ultimately accountable for what does or does not happen in our nation's capital. The fact is, we cannot afford a toxic mix of public ignorance and apathy. All our citizens need to become more informed and involved if we want to accelerate the transformational reforms that are so necessary to put us on a more prudent and sustainable path. To make that happen, we need to lay out the facts to the American people, speak the truth, talk about the tough choices we need to make, and explain the absolute necessity of acting sooner rather than later and the potential adverse consequences to our country and our families if we fail to do so. It will take capable and credible people engaging with representative groups of Americans across the country, but I'm confident that it can be done. At the same time, those in positions of power and influence must listen to the American people and learn from them. Washington experts don't have all the answers, not by a long stretch. Our policymakers need to benefit from the ideas, experiences, and perspectives of citizens across the country. That is how we will fashion policies that truly address the concerns and priorities of those who actually pay the nation's bills. This citizen education effort should be conducted in selected cities around the country and shared from coast to coast via the latest communication technologies. And it needs to take place soon, given the lessons from the recent mortgage-related subprime crisis, the recent fiscal warning signs from Europe, which are on pages A1 of both the Washington Post, New York Times, and other major papers around the world, and the growing concerns expressed publicly by Americans, our foreign lenders, and others. In this regard, I am pleased to announce that the Peterson Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation are partnering to make this need a reality this summer. We are very appreciative that Mike Stegman, Director of Policy and Housing at the MacArthur Foundation, and Ann Mosel, VP for Programs at the Kellogg Foundation, have joined us here today to demonstrate our shared commitment to this important effort. By pooling our resources, on Saturday, June 26th, an unprecedented citizen education and engagement exercise will be conducted that will focus on our federal fiscal challenge. This national effort will involve representative groups of Americans in 20 cities around the country, all of which will be linked via satellite and the web. The participants will be provided the fiscal facts and then asked to express their views on a broad range of reform options. Very importantly, they will also be asked how to prepare proposed reform packages that will achieve certain longer-term fiscal objectives. After all, failing to effectively address our large and growing structural deficit is simply not an option. This historic civic exercise will be conducted by America Speaks, a nonpartisan organization with considerable experience and a proven track record in conducting similar forums. Rest assured that the information and options provided in this exercise will be accurate, reasonable, and comprehensive. To help ensure this, America Speaks has engaged several advisory groups, each comprised of individuals that span the political and ideological spectrum. I am pleased that Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer, CEO of America Speaks, has also joined us here today. We are confident that the results of this citizen education effort will prove extremely valuable to federal elected officials, the President's Fiscal Responsibility and Reform Commission, the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force, the press, the general public, and others. But it's critical to understand that this effort should not be a substitute for a range of citizen education and engagement efforts that the two commissions and that individual members of Congress should conduct on their own initiative. Only through substantial and sustained outreach beyond Washington's Beltway will we be able to bring the kinds of reforms that can put this nation back on the path to fiscal sanity. You will hear more about our related efforts in the coming weeks. Before I conclude my remarks in this conference, I'd like to ask Mike, Ann, and Carolyn to make a few brief remarks. And so, Mike, if you could come up first, then followed by Ann and Carolyn, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Bringing together thousands of diverse Americans from across the country simultaneously to discuss the nation's fiscal challenges holds the promise of spurring an even broader national dialogue. This would help build the urgency and political will necessary to tackle our deficit and debt. MacArthur supported the recent nonpartisan report by the National Research Council and the National Academy of Public Administration that argued under continuation of the current trajectory of the federal budget, the nation faces the risk of a disruptive fiscal crisis, concluding that forceful, even painful action must be taken soon to alter the nation's fiscal course. The report contains a range of tax and spending options that could be adopted to stabilize the debt within a decade. Because every day's delay in fixing our fiscal policies implies necessary spending cuts and revenue increases have to be larger and more abrupt, it is urgent that we get about the task at hand. And it is in that spirit we are pleased now to support this creative new effort with America Speaks, among several others, to inform and engage the American public and find common ground. Thank you. Ann?
Thank you, Mike. Before I get my remarks started, I'd like to just really thank the Peterson Foundation and especially Secretary Peterson for his unwavering passion and leadership on a very difficult subject. I come here from Battle Creek, Michigan. The Kellogg Foundation was created in 1929 by a man who sold brooms door to door. It was many years and many decades before he created the Kellogg Company that has now resulted in $7.5 billion in assets that we are able to use to propel vulnerable children forward. So when we were approached about this grant, this was a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. We spend about $300 million a year, based in the state of Michigan, while also doing national and international work, thinking about how can we improve the lives of kids each day, next year, 5 years from now. The issues that we've been talking about today will define this generation, the next generation, and beyond. So collaborating with our colleagues, both the MacArthur Foundation that has a distinguished track record at the community level, and with the Peterson Foundation, we wanted to bring our passion and focus around kids, vulnerability, equity, and civic engagement. 2 quick reminders about when you get into the civic engagement business. One, and I think Alice Ridland said it really well. One, the American public can do 2 things at one time. They can think about their daily crisis, and they can think about the years ahead. I think we have to honor that wisdom. About a couple months ago, I worked with the Stanford University Center for Deliberative Democracy. I spent 3 full days with 300 residents of Michigan that was scientifically representative of the state, from CEOs to janitors to teachers to young people and everybody in between. The project was called Hard Times, Tough Choices. They were willing to make the tough choices, but they have to have credible things to respond to. We cannot underestimate the willingness and the will of the people. We also, when we engage the public, have to remember to listen. And with that, I'd like to, before I turn it over to Carolyn, we had the opportunity, the Kellogg Foundation, among many others, to support America Speaks in the crisis of Katrina. America Speaks went door to door, trailer to trailer, to engage the citizens of New Orleans in defining their future. Those voices, those conversations resulted into a lot of great policies and solutions. Still a lot more work to do, but America Speaks was wonderful in truly engaging the public. Thank you.
Almost every speaker here today has emphasized the absolute necessity of educating the public and engaging the public in the fiscal challenges facing our nation. And thanks to Peterson, MacArthur, and Kellogg, America Speaks is privileged to bring together on June 26th, every walk of life will be represented simultaneously in 20 cities across the country and in many other communities and congressional districts and community conversations to look at the facts about the situation that the country is facing and to look at the options in terms of changing the curve in health care costs, in terms of, although we've heard many times today it's a much smaller part of the problem, but it is a structural part of the problem, on Social Security and on revenue options, and all the other non-discretionary domestic items and defense. What we've learned over a decade and a half in the privilege of doing this work is 4 things. And actually Leslie Stahl said, I don't know if she's still here, but she said this morning, and we actually used the tapes of that 60-minute segment on the budget process in the 90s to train some of our teams that are out doing the organizing around the country today. But here's the 4 things we've learned every time we've done one of these projects, no matter what the topic, no matter where in the country. The public really wants to be at the table. They are really willing to give up their personal time and to listen open-mindedly and open-heartedly to each other to, number 2, come to solutions. It's one of the extraordinary pieces of social capital in this country. Americans want to solve problems, and they want to do it by discovering common ground. And the last piece of conventional wisdom that is really at a peak right now in the country is that people inside the Beltway won't listen to people outside the Beltway. It's easy to understand why that's what we think, given what is available to us to understand. But as Ann said, and has been our experience in every case, when in fact the public is brought together in demographically representative samples, it's not just this interest group, it's not just this age group, but it's the whole public together. Lawmakers and decision makers are more than happy to listen. And in this case, the President's Commission, the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force, the Senate Budget Committee, Majority and Minority, the House Budget Committee, Majority and Minority, have already agreed to listen to these outcomes. It's exactly like Alan Greenspan said at the end of his talk. The lesson that he would pass on to the Commission is it has to be connected to the realpolitik. Based on the generosity of these funders, the timing of this national discussion is connected to the realpolitik. And it is exactly what gives me the hope and optimism that something really will come out of this year's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, Ann, and Carolyn, for those words. We're looking forward to June 26th, Saturday, coming up. As this summit comes to a conclusion, there is one more critical ingredient for success that we must acknowledge. We must find ways to bridge the current partisan and ideological divides that have reached epidemic proportions in Washington. In the end, the only way to turn ideas into action is to offer nonpartisan policy options and non-ideological proposals that can achieve broad-based bipartisan support. Doing so will require special processes as well as courage and extraordinary leadership from the President of the United States and key congressional leaders. We must not give up hope. All this can happen. Yes, we can still ensure that our collective future is better than our past. And yes, we can achieve fiscal responsibility in ways that ensure social justice. These 2 key concepts are not mutually exclusive. We at the Peterson Foundation will do our part. This includes bringing attention to possible solutions, ranging from comprehensive tax and social insurance program reforms to statutory budget controls, to reprioritizing, constraining defense and other spending, especially health care costs. We will also promote efforts to help ensure that elected officials either make the required decisions or are held accountable if they fail to do so. After all, our fiscal clock is ticking, and time is not working in our favor. In closing, the Peterson Foundation is eager to work with all of you as we face up to our nation's fiscal challenge. Please review the information in today's participant package and encourage others to do so by going to our Foundation's website, www.pgpf.org. That's www.pgpf.org. If all of us do our part, we can keep America great and preserve the American dream for future generations. We owe our nation's founders and our families no less. Let's do it together. Thank you. Safe travels.